So spring's finally arrived. I heard a couple people, different people this week talking about how it was spring. Of course, the first day of spring was not a good day for spring, and it's not been the best since spring actually got here. But spring was always a fun time for me because it meant baseball season. So April was when baseball kicked off when I was younger. That's when Little League would start, and it would go through April and then in part of May. Now, if you were lucky, maybe you got to play on an all-star team that played into June. And there was one summer that I played on a team that played baseball all year, all summer. Just all summer, not all year, just all summer. And that was the best year because it wasn't just the spring that was baseball, it was the whole summer. Because normal years, baseball would end and it would be June, and maybe there would be church camp in there, either in June or early July. And then 4th of July would come, and then there wasn't much else for my summer. Maybe we would do a family vacation until the 4-H fair. Now, I wasn't in 4-H, but we always would go to the fair, and we would, we would watch the parade, but we would go to the fair and have food and look at things, and then we would watch the parade. So my grandparents lived on Jackson Street, so we had a place to sit. Now, I did not appreciate that until they no longer had that place. And then all of a sudden I had to say, we don't know where we're going to sit if we go to the parade. And it's a scramble. Now I know there's lots of people who kind of find their place so they know where to go. We've kind of figured that out. But it was so nice every year just to know that I'm going to my grandparents, that there's not going to be anybody in their area except our family, and we know there'll be room there. And we're going to put our chairs out or be fighting to watch the parade. Now, this is the thing. Have you actually thought about parades? Have you actually thought about it? We go and we line streets, and then we watch people walk or drive down these streets. Maybe there's floats or there's signs. They might throw candy. But why is it that we enjoy these so much? It's not just an American thing either. I don't know if you paid attention, but last year, whenever King Charles was coronated, they had a giant parade. Now, I don't know if you saw that gold, I don't even know what you call it. It was a coach. It's some old coach they've had for years, and it's horse-driven, but it's completely gold. Now, I don't know if he actually rode that, but I know that it's one of the many coaches that the royal family has, and there was a discussion before the coronation. Are they going to get the gold coach out? And they would have the parade. And we have parades in Washington, D.C. after there's inauguration of the president. So it's a human thing to have parades. And it's not just a recent thing. The Romans had parades. The Roman emperors would have something called a triumph. So after they would have a military victory, specifically when they conquered an enemy, they would come back into the city and they'd have this triumph, this giant parade where they would come into the city, they'd bring the spoils of war. They would bring prisoners and even the remains of leaders from these fights, and they would bring them into the city to parade their victory. It's not a good thing, not something that you want to see in a parade today, but that's what they would do. Parades have always been part of human history. There's even a parade in the Gospels, and we already foreshadowed this parade today when we did our procession with the palms. But have you actually stopped to think about the parade that's in the gospel stories? The story about Jesus in his entry into Jerusalem on that week before the beginning of Holy Week. That's what we're going to do today. We're going to take a look at this story and we're going to explore it again. So if you're going to take out your Bibles and turn to Mark chapter 11, we're going to be looking at this story together. So Mark 11, if you want to follow along, page 1443. It will also be here on the Pew Bible. Or not on the Pew Bible, up here on the screen. 1443 is the page in the Pew Bible. So let's take a look at this story together. This is how it opens up. As they approached Jerusalem and came to Bethphage and Bethany at the Mount of Olives, Jesus sent two of his disciples, saying to them, "Go to the village ahead of you, and just as you enter it, you will find a colt tied there, which no one has ever ridden. Untie it and bring it here. If anyone asks you, 'Why are you doing this?' say the Lord needs it and we'll send it back here shortly. So Jesus' parade story starts with him entering Jerusalem. Now we need to understand why he's going to Jerusalem. He's going for Passover. So the image that we need to understand is that the roads leading to Jerusalem are packed with hundreds and hundreds of pilgrims. People traveling from all over the ancient world, Jewish and also interested Gentiles, to come to the holy city of Jerusalem for Passover. So there's people all over on these roads. It's not as if Jesus and his disciples are the only people. It's packed. And they're coming to celebrate the Passover. And what Jesus does is he gets just outside the city. There's some villages that are kind of just outside the city. And he says to two disciples, okay, I want you to go to the next village. And there's a colt there. I know it's there. I want you to bring that colt to me. And it's colt as in a young donkey. And he says, I want you to bring it to me. And if anyone asks you what you're doing, just say that the Lord needs it. And you'll be fine. So the disciples go in verse 4. They went and they found a colt outside in the street, tied at a doorway. As they untied it, some people standing there asked, what are you doing untying that colt? They answered as Jesus had told them to, and the people let them go. When they brought the colt to Jesus and threw their cloaks over it, he sat on it. So now we kind of see what's going on. Jesus is getting ready for his parade, and he's found his ride, his float, as we would think about today. Now, obviously, it's an actual animal. He's not making a float. But he is planning his entrance. When I was in high school, I worked for my uncle. A lot of people know Mark Donaghy. He did landscaping here. He's done a lot of your landscaping, I'm sure. So when I worked for my uncle, he would have a float in the 4-H fair parade a lot of years. So I remember one year specifically, I was working for him and I helped get this ready. So he had at that time this big truck. I don't know what kind of truck it was. I know that the back bed would lift off and he could change it and put different things on it. But one of the beds he had was a flatbed. And so it was at least this high to get up on this truck. It was high. So on this big flatbed, we piled dirt and soil and we made a mound. And then he got big, I think what he would call river rock. We're talking about like he needed to lift this with his skid loader to get it up on, and maybe it was a skid loader and something else. They had to get two things out to lift these rocks up on this truck. So he gets everything put out nice, and he gets some trees and some plants that are still in the pots. He puts them up there, and then he covers it with mulch. And then he sticks a sign in there that says MD Landscaping with his phone number. He's getting ready for the parade. And it looked nice. If I saw that, I would want him to do my landscaping because it looked good. And if he could do that on the back of a truck, imagine what he could do with your actual land. He was getting ready. So this is what Jesus is doing. He's getting ready for the parade. And what he's going to do is he's going to ride a young donkey. Now, what we need to ask is why? Why would he choose this mode of transportation? What is it about the donkey? The other thing we need to ask is, how would this choice be perceived by the people around him? Because that's just as important. If we think about the 4-H Fair ambassadors, they want to make the right choice for their ride. I remember last year, one of the ambassadors was riding a fire truck. And a lot of years, people find convertible Corvettes, convertible Mustangs, or some other old car, something that stands out as and memorable. What you ride matters. So why is it that Jesus chose this young donkey? Why did he choose this colt? To find out, we have to keep reading. In verse 8, many people spread their cloaks on the road, while others spread branches they had cut in the fields. All right, so this is where we get the palms. Now remember, there's people coming from all over, and there's lots of them. So it's not just Jesus and his disciples. And all of a sudden, Jesus is on this donkey. Now if you've ever seen like a children's cartoon depiction of this, usually it's just Jesus riding on this donkey with nobody else around and everybody just sort of looking at him. Now I don't think that's quite how it was. But there's people who happen to notice. And if you lived in the area, you would probably be out of your house as people come through. It's this time of celebration. And people notice and they start to put cloaks on the road, which we know does have some connection to royalty. It's not necessarily a super strong connection, but there is connection to that, of cloaks being laid down as royalty can pass over them. Also, the palm branches, which have a connection to a couple hundred years before Jesus in what's called the Maccabean period, whenever Israel actually was independent between the Greek, or basically the rulers who ruled after Alexander the Great before the Romans. There was a time whenever Jews were free, and they had their own king again. And that was connected to these palm branches. And so these palm branches were there. They were part of the celebration, and they get put down as Jesus goes by. So people are taking notice. But what about the colt? Well, there's a connection that some other gospel authors notice that Mark doesn't mention about Jesus' colt. And it's from Zechariah 9:9. Rejoice greatly, daughter Zion. Shout, daughter Jerusalem. See, your king comes to you, righteous and victorious, lowly and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. Some Jewish leaders and rabbis in the time of Jesus understood this to be a messianic prophecy. Now, Jesus understood it that way, absolutely, and the gospel authors understood it that way, and that's why it's in the Gospels, and that's why they reference this as part of Jesus' message. But it's not clear that everybody there maybe knew what was going on. It's not clear that they figured out exactly why Jesus was doing this. But as we look back, we see all the symbols. We see the colt. We see these cloaks. We see these palm branches. The gospel authors and Jesus himself want to tell us something about this moment. Let's keep going. Verse 9 of Mark, not of Zechariah, chapter 11, verse 9. Those who went ahead and those who followed shouted, Hosanna! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the coming kingdom of our father David. Hosanna in the highest. So we often think about this as a clear indication of people welcoming Jesus as king to Jerusalem. And I think it's okay for us to understand that, but we need to understand a little bit more about what's being said here. Part of those words are from Psalm 118, which is called a psalm of ascent. There's a series of psalms at the end of this psalm book. And they're all these psalms that people would sing as they climbed the mountain to Jerusalem for their pilgrimages. Now, no matter where direction you came from, Jerusalem was on a mountain, so you had to climb to get to it. So for the last leg of the pilgrimage, as you climbed the mountain, you would sing these psalms of ascent. And so people heard these psalms, and they might have just associated it with the pilgrims. But those psalms inherently are about God saving his people, the very message that Jesus brings. So it's not clear how much people realized about what was going on, but as we look back, we can very much see that Jesus has got his royal parade, his triumphant, or his triumph as they talked about in Rome. But did people notice on that day? That's the question. Verse 11. Jesus entered Jerusalem and went into the temple courts. He looked around at everything, but since it was already late, he went to Bethany with the 12. It's really a non-climactic ending. We like to think of the triumphal entry as this huge event. But when Jesus gets into the city, and he would have entered the city from a direction where the temple was right inside the gates. So he walks into the city, and there's the temple. And he goes in, not much is going on, and he leaves. Now, if there had been something going on, as in if people had noticed what was going on, and people had started to gather because they think Jesus is the king returning to Jerusalem, he most certainly would have been arrested on the spot. Rome was always looking out for that, specifically during Passover. But that's not what happens. But looking back, I think we can see Jesus is trying to tell us something about what's going on. First, he carefully chose his ride. He wanted to choose a ride that made a connection for people. That connection is to Zechariah. So he's saying that God's anointed Messiah was returning to take up his throne. That's what he's saying. So just as what the ambassadors choose as their rides is important, Jesus' ride was important too. But he didn't choose a convertible. He didn't choose a fire truck. He didn't choose a Porsche or a Lamborghini, which in those days would have been a fancy chariot or a war horse or something. He chose a donkey to make that connection to Zechariah. So in our day, it's like him choosing a Prius or an old Accord. You know, it's reliable, but not impressive. And you don't buy that car if you're trying to impress people, but you might buy that car if you're wanting to have it for a long time. This is what he's trying to tell us. Jesus came as a humble servant king. That's what the triumphant entry tells us. It's not what we always think. It's not like the Roman emperor who had a huge parade and the spoils of war and prisoners. It wasn't that. Jesus came as a humble servant king. Palm Sunday starts Holy Week, and it's the central story of Jesus. And this is how it starts, with Jesus entering humbly into Jerusalem. It's the moment where God returns to his people. It's the moment when he comes to take up his throne and to rule again. But we need to notice that Jesus didn't come like human kings. He didn't come like even King Charles with his fancy gold chariot, or whatever that would be called, a coach. It's not like some of the military parades we see held around the world, where leaders want to parade their power. Jesus didn't do any of that. Instead, Jesus came as a humble servant. Even our 4-H fair parade with its convertibles and John Deere tractors is more fancy than Jesus and his humble donkey. But that's how he wanted to come. He came as a humble servant. So as we enter Holy Week, we must remember this about Jesus. He took his throne through a pure act of humble self-sacrifice. And he's going to take his throne by going to the cross. And that's what the triumphant entry tells us about Jesus. He came as a humble servant king. This is what we can't forget. We're called to be like him, to be humble servants and to put others first. So we think back about the core values that we talked about at the beginning of the year. All 5 of those values require humility. I understand that it takes humility and courage to invite somebody to worship next week. I'm nervous about it too, but I am asking all of you to do it, so I have some people I'm going to invite. But I understand it takes humility. It's scary, but it's also about being a servant. You don't think Jesus was scared about what was ahead? When we read the night he gets arrested, I think we can understand that he was not that comfortable with what was going to happen. But he was ready to do what he had to do. So Jesus did throw himself a parade, but it wasn't the type of parade we'd expect. And why is that? It's because Jesus came as a humble servant king.